So my name's David Bell. I am a partner at Fenwick & West. I want to welcome you all to our panel here today about law meets code. What we're really talking about is AI regulation and how it impacts startups. And so I'll just let my co-panelists briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll kick things off.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chum Phee. I'm General Counsel at Databricks. I have been practicing in Silicon Valley for 30 years now, 3.5 years at Databricks.
I'm Matt Peralt. I'm head of AI policy at Andreessen Horowitz, the venture capital firm. Before this, I was at the center. I directed the Center on Technology Policy at UNC Chapel Hill. Before that, I was down the street at Duke University, and before that, I was on the public policy team at Meta.
So to kick things off, maybe I'll ask both of you, who should care what companies are impacted by AI regulation?
Matt?
So we care a lot about the companies that are impacted by AI regulation. And the reason that my job exists, I started in this role in November, so I've been in it almost a year, is that Andreessen Horowitz was really concerned that startups were left out of conversations about what the right governance structure would be for AI. We saw lots of discussion of things like licensing regimes and regulatory agencies that would govern AI and significant administrative burdens that might be imposed on AI companies. And the thought that the leadership of our firm had is that this might work for some companies in the ecosystem, but there are a whole separate set of companies, the companies that are really important for our work, that are not well represented. And for those companies, these regulatory burdens wouldn't work well. They would make it harder for us to compete with larger, more established companies. So when I was at Meta, I was on the public policy team. When I left in the fall of 2019, there were 600 people on the public policy team. As a lot of the people in this room know, because I know that you work for organizations that are on a different part of the tech ecosystem, there are lots of companies that don't have anyone on a public policy team, might not have anyone on a legal team, might not have a general counsel, might not have a communications team. And those are companies that we're really focused on when we're thinking about what are the right governance regimes that might work in AI.
I'll just add on to that, every time there is like a new wave of technology, there's always going to be regulators who will want to come in and think about how that technology should be regulated. And when you think about like AI, obviously it's been around for a long time. In the past couple of years, it's really had a lot of focus. And so given the potential for the societal impact, that has like regulators really itching that there's this the technology that they think is kind of relatively new. And then with the potential societal impact, there definitely is a lot of desire to regulate. The thought is as to like what to regulate and to what extent, because obviously they still want to encourage innovation. But to Matt's point, earlier on, a lot of the discussion was around like fear mongering, right? And so I really am glad that firms like A16Z are coming out and really helping the smaller folks within the AI ecosystem, because they also need to have a voice. And the fear mongering, that really needs to be countered, effectively by folks who are going beyond and being protective of the ecosystem.
I think that's exactly right, that like when a new technology is introduced, policymakers wonder what are all the potential harms, and they're focused on how can we address some of those harms. But I think one of the odd things about AI as well is that some of the battles that we've been fighting aren't related to AI at all. They're related to social media regulatory battles where lawmakers are really concerned. We missed the boat with social media. We didn't establish the right governance regimes. This technology got way out ahead of us. Now we see this new technology, and we don't want it to have the same trajectory. And so we're going to try to use a more robust regulatory playbook earlier on in the technology's development to address some of those harms. And the challenge from our standpoint, from your standpoint, I think, is that AI is not social media. And so trying to approach it with a we're fighting the battle that occurred in the past is not going to result in the healthiest AI market we can have in the future.
Another thing that I would add to that is like where there is regulation, there also is opportunity, right? And so there's an opportunity for companies to come in and develop solutions that are actually implementing the guardrails that regulators are talking about. So regulation in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but being able to kind of get ahead of the curve and make sure that all of the voices are kind of heard.
one of the related questions that gets asked is, should if I'm in a company that's doing in-house development versus licensing in AI technology, should I care about this? How should I be thinking about that?
I mean, I think that, the regulations seem to be, on one end on the AI model developers, and in particular, the frontier model developers. That's on the one end. The other end is like AI deployers. And there are different sets of regulations that are going to apply to each one. And so if you're going to be a model developer, unless you're in the frontier development, I'm not sure what the regulatory regime is really going to look like. But I think almost all of us are going to fall within the deployer, right? Even if we are not presenting a solution, we're all going to be using AI within our companies. And so I don't think that using a licensing model necessarily is the easiest path out. Using the licensing model, though, is going to potentially give you the opportunity to, from a contractual perspective, allocate the administrative burden around compliance, for example. There also could be shifting of liability. So that is one thing, whereas you're balancing whether you're a developer or whether you're going to use a licensing model. There might be that chance contractually for you to be able to do that. The last thing I'll add is around the licensing model. There's a lot of really good open source models out there. And so obviously those are free, but the cost of that would be the limitation of being able to contractually, reallocate that risk. And oftentimes you'll see in those license agreements the requirement that you indemnify the provider of the open source software. But I think regardless of which regime you're in, there are going to be regulations that you're going to have to comply with.
So there's talk about regulation both at the federal and state level, about rules about how trade or how they're deployed, as you're noting. Matt, maybe you can talk a little bit about one of the rules at the federal level versus the state level.
Yeah, so we've spent a lot of time thinking about the roles for the federal government and the roles for the state government. And there are a lot of the conversations on this issue will either occupy one pole or the other. So there are people who say, AI is a national issue, it involves AI, it involves interstate commerce. And so therefore we need Congress to act, and we need Congress exclusively to set AI policy for the country. That's on one side. On the other side, and we've heard this recently in California actually, people will say Congress isn't acting, Congress isn't doing enough to govern this market, and therefore we need states to act. And in our view, both of those poles oversimplify what we think is the optimal policy position. States and the federal government in our Constitution each have a role to play, but they don't have the exact same role to play. And so that means if Congress hasn't acted, that doesn't give states a license to all of a sudden do things that violate the Dormant Commerce Clause, that impose costs on out-of-state commerce, that dramatically outweigh the benefits for the citizens of California. At the same time, it's important that states do play a role in AI policymaking. So states have traditionally had the role of policing harmful conduct within their borders. Tram, as you were saying, it's really important that we have governance in place to protect people against harmful uses of AI. And so that means that states will have an active role in enforcing their criminal law, in enforcing consumer protection law, enforcing civil rights law. Right now, I think the balance is a little bit unclear. States are seeing themselves as needing to occupy this lead position because they don't see Congress acting. And one of the things that we're trying to do right now in Washington is develop a federal framework to set some of those roles, some of the rules of the road for national AI policymaking, and then leave states to do the work that states have traditionally done.
A lot of times, too, for the states, I think that, there have been a few states who have been very active on the AI statutory front, but by and large, there are existing laws, right? Existing privacy laws, existing laws around employment, labor issues, employment discrimination, et cetera. And so I do think that, thinking about the existing statutory framework and how that might apply, because a lot of those laws really can be leveraged and applied to the AI framework as well.
So, Chum, how different, you guys operate internationally, and I think all of us have heard about regulation in Europe, for example, here. So how different are the US and EU and other markets approaching in terms of pace and nature of regulation here?
I think for the past decade or so, the EU has been a pace setter in terms of regulation, and starting with the GDPR that went into effect in 2018, and ending most recently with the EU AI Act. But there's actually been quite a bit of major legislation in between. I mean, you have the Digital Services Act, for instance, that provided a lot of obligations with respect to providers of digital services, and in particular trying to give more control to users of their online experience. You have the Digital Markets Act, which was a competition-focused statute around the gatekeepers that were designated by the EU and obligations and prohibitions that they had. Most recently, the EU Data Act went into effect in September, and which focuses on data that is generated by users, businesses, etc. So most recently, of course, the EU AI Act then has gone into effect, and I do think that most jurisdictions. There's been what you might have heard as the Brussels effect, where a lot of countries are going to follow what the EU is doing. So what I'm hearing from a lot of peers from other companies is that they are fully expecting, they're building their compliance programs around AI, around the EU AI Act, and similar to what companies have been doing with the GDPR, they'll have the umbrella policy being what Europe has done. And then under that, for specific legislation that will come online, their programs will be built under that umbrella policy. So I expect that that's going to happen with the EU AI Act.
I think a lot of states are also copying, is my impression, a lot of what the EU does, states use as a core place that they focus on how they develop their own laws.
I think that's right, but I think that there's been talk about whether there's going to be further delay of the AI Act in terms of its implementation. I actually think that as a framework, though, with their focus on high-risk use cases, their focus on frontier models, having a risk-based approach to it, and really being focused on consequential decision-making, the high-risk use cases really are around health and safety and fundamental rights. I do think that provides for a good framework for companies that doesn't seem overly onerous. Obviously, we'll learn more in the coming years in terms of how that gets enforced. But at least as it stands now, it seems to me to be a decent framework for companies to work with.
I think there are aspects of it that are positive, but we have been concerned about the amount of administrative burden that it might impose. So Jen Palka, who was formerly a California resident, now she's in DC. She was the former Deputy Chief Technology Officer in the United States in the Obama administration. She wrote an amazing book I'd highly recommend called Recoding America. Came out a couple years ago, and I read it recently. And she had a phrase for this regulatory approach, which is paperwork favors the powerful. And there are a lot of the bills in Europe have a paperwork favors the powerful approach. We have some concern, and because of that concern, we're going to make you go through a whole administrative process to try to make sure that you identify what those concerns are and protect against future harms. So that has a lot of downsides, I think, from our perspective, which is that when you're trying to start an AI company, it's already unbelievably challenging. You have immense data needs, you have immense computing power needs, you have personnel, talent costs. It's really, really challenging to build a competitive AI company. Now, in certain jurisdictions, you have these additional barriers, these regulatory barriers that take this paperwork-oriented approach that make it harder for you to get your models off the ground. So in our view, those are generally not the optimal way to ensure that we have a competitive landscape. So then the question becomes, well, if we're not going to do that, is the right answer to do nothing? And as you were saying earlier, and as we believe, there is a more direct way to address the harms. So rather than set up the paperwork favors the powerful administrative processes that people have to go through that I think creates disproportionate burdens for startups, you can actually go right at the harms. And so you were mentioning all these different bodies of law, consumer protection law, civil rights law, criminal law, where if you are concerned about harmful use of AI, you can enforce existing laws. And then to the extent there are gaps in existing law that don't cover use cases that we think are problematic, we can try to pass new laws that address those specific use cases, but focus on on regulating the harmful use directly, as opposed to creating this burdensome process that makes AI markets less competitive.
So we talked a little bit about Europe already. I guess the question that often gets asked then is, should early stage startups be thinking about international regulation already? So thoughts, either of you?
Well, I definitely think that if your products have a global use case, then it makes sense to think globally at the outset. There's one portion with respect to copyright law that oftentimes that's viewed as being very territorial. That might be a trap for the unwary, though. I mean, plaintiffs' lawyers have been super aggressive about territoriality issues on copyright. But that is an area where, with respect to training, for model training, for instance, that some people have thought that there might be safety given the territorial nature of copyright law.
I think we want the answer to that question to maybe not be no, but to be that it doesn't occupy a significant percentage of a founder's time. I think that we want founders to be focused on building the great technologies of the future, to be outcompeting incumbents, to be really competitive in exciting new markets. I think the answer today is, unfortunately, you should keep an eye on regulatory developments because there are developments that are going to impact you. Example that I had from something that I did with one of our speedrun companies a couple of weeks ago is that I was walking a group of people through some pending legislation in California, not knowing necessarily whether any of the specific bills would apply to any of the people in the room. And one of the people in the room, I could see his face fall as I was describing certain provisions and something that right now is on Governor Newsom's desk for signature. And it turns out that piece of legislation would actually significantly constrain his business. He's trying to do something that would be focused on creating positive use cases for minors. And right now, as probably many of you in the room know, that is a hotly contested political space where there's a lot of concern about risk for minors for very good reason, that we should have policymakers focused on that issue, but do it in a way that enables good use cases to flourish, where people are coming up with services that are really going to benefit people, and then punish the harmful use cases and the bad actors who are really doing things that are creating challenges and harms for kids.
So Matt, coming back to you then, how are VCs assessing the impact of AI regulation on startups, and are there red flags or maybe green flags that you're looking for with respect to startups as you think about it?
Yes, I mean, as I've been describing, the focus for us really is trying to think when someone goes into the garage or dorm room or whatever the space is where they're creating the next thing, we want that process to have potential and possibility. We don't want it to be closed off. We don't want that entrepreneur to face such a significant headwind and burden and challenge in building a tool that they don't start. We hear sometimes in our meetings with policymakers, they'll say something that they intend to be reassuring, and we don't hear it that way. They'll say, this is just intended for a small number of companies. Or sometimes they'll say, this is just intended for a group of companies who are building at the frontier. Don't worry, that's not going to cover startups. And we don't hear that. That is not reassuring to us, because we want startups to be able to build at the frontier. We want them to be competitive. We want the new emerging markets to be as competitive as possible. And so when we're thinking about what are regulatory proposals that are workable from our perspective, we are trying to think about that. What does the burden feel like from an entrepreneur? But also, I think really importantly, we're also trying to think about whether there are ways to address harms more directly. And so as I came into this job, I was focused a lot on the don't regulate development, part of our core policy position. Don't regulate development, instead regulate harmful use. And I think in the last couple of months, I've focused much more on why regulating development is actually not going to target the use cases I think that we think are most problematic. If we stripped everything down to zero and we said, okay, there's this new technology coming out, what is the way that we want to protect ourselves from the harmful use cases? We would not say, go and do some general disclosures on your website. I don't think we would say, hire a firm to do an impact assessment, conduct an audit. I think what we would be focused on is, when this technology is used in a way that results in fraud, you have recourse. When this technology is used in a way that violates state or federal criminal law, you have recourse. When there is an unfair or deceptive practice, you have recourse. And so my hope is that the dynamic shifts in that direction and we actually come up with governance regimes that really address the harms more directly, and that's responsive to policymakers' concerns, and we leave entrepreneurs to do the great work that they're doing.
Chum, with evolving state privacy laws, things like the CCPA or the CPRA, how does building fine-tuning models on user data impact a startup's risk profile?
I mean, I think that if you're going to be, trying to, use user data, that, I mean, the privacy laws aren't focused on prohibiting that necessarily. I mean, they're focused on making sure that you have disclosure about what you're doing and you're getting consent. And so paying attention to like what your use case is and providing appropriate disclosure for that. I mean, I also think that as you're thinking about, how to get consent, I mean, is there a sweetener that could be provided, like a give to get program where, yes, you get to get the customer data, you get that consent, but in return, they get a free feature or they get to do X. And so, thinking about how you might be able to get that consent, I think is a useful approach. One other thing to be thinking about, though, is that, beyond just getting that consent, thinking about like what the security framework is around it, because it's not just going to be privacy concerns. So there's a huge, cyber concern as well. And so like making sure, and in particular, if you think that your users are going to be large enterprises, and they're going to want to make sure that there is appropriate governance and security over that.
So bigger data sets are generally thought to help improve model accuracy, but they're also in a lot of these privacy and regulatory regimes, a notion around minimization principles for data, especially personal data. How do you think about that in that context?
Yes, regulators are going to be very focused on minimizing the amount of personal data that you're using. So I do think that making sure that you have a reasonable approach on what is your use case and what is the minimum amount of data that you would need in order to support that use case. I do think that that is like an expectation of regulators. It's really important in their view in terms of like a fundamental principle of privacy protection. So, but that said, I'm going to push back a little bit, David, on your framing of it about like needing larger and larger data sets, because obviously this is such a fast-moving and innovative space. And I'm not sure whether, I mean, depending on your use case, do you really need the biggest and largest, right, an ever-increasing data set? I'm not sure whether I see that. Definitely seen a lot of good work that's come out with much smaller data sets.
So, Matt, maybe we'll start with you for the next sort of questions that I have around practical advice for startups. What are the most important legal and regulatory developments with respect to AI that startups leaders should be thinking about, have on their radar as they're going forward?
So I definitely think, just given the pace, it should really be focused on things at the state level. And so obviously for anyone who's based in this state, focusing on things that are currently, there are things moving in real time. So I think feels like a long time ago. I think it was last week the governor signed SB 53, which is primarily disclosure regime, but also for startups, like it has whistleblower protections and critical incident reporting and stuff. So there's stuff in that bill that will require startups to do work on day one. The second bill that hasn't yet been signed or vetoed, but is on the governor's desk right now is 1064, which is focused, as I was describing before, on issues related to kids. So I think for startups that are trying to target a youth market, that's bill, if it's signed, will end up having a significant impact on what you're able to do and what you're not.
I mean, another one in California that's actually going into effect at the beginning of next year is AB 2013, which is focused on transparency with respect to model development. And so that's another one to make sure that you're paying attention to.
That was passed in the last session, right? Is that
exactly?
Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean,
and it goes into effect soon.
I think some like there's one development of where like people are focused on the bills that are passed at any particular moment. So I remember like the before I started in this job, the focus on the package the governor signed last session. Mm-hmm. And I think what is a little bit harder to see clearly, and this is something that we're kind of trying to articulate, is like, what does all that mean? What are the multiple years of regulatory frameworks that are passed in AI, what does that mean again for the person who's trying to get a company off the ground? And I think like you could look at SB 53, which is this disclosure requirement, and think like, oh, maybe this is reasonable on its own. But the thing is, it's not on its own.
Exactly.
There are all these different things that are now coming into play. And I think, as you're suggesting, are like things from past years that will be coming into effect in the years ahead. And that's going to create like a complicated regime within California. Like people talk about the patchwork at the state level. I guess it's not exactly a patchwork, but it will be a multi-layered compliance regime with many different components that already is set to go into effect here.
The other thing about the new things that are coming online is the startups generally don't have the advantage of seeing the prior versions of implementation of how do we solve the problem with the regulation, and what do you do to accommodate it. And when you're talking about something like that that's coming online, there aren't great examples that you can say, I'm just going to copy what X company did because they took a pretty reasonable approach. Everybody's still figuring all of these things out.
I think it's such a great point, and there's an additional dimension that pushes in the same direction too, which is larger companies have a lot of these processes set up already. So like if you're asking a company to do an impact assessment, it looks really different if you are Microsoft and you already do a whole set of privacy impact assessments. You do a whole set of human rights impact assessments. When I was at Meta, I did some of our human rights related work. Those are things that their teams already built around. So you're asking in your already well-established and like honed over many years, sometimes in part because of an FTC consent order that you've been working under, you've been hiring against it for a long period of time, you've got a process set up and you're just adding AI to that existing process. That's very different than a company that is starting this process from scratch and hasn't had to deal with anything like this and is now being told it needs to build a compliance regime.
That's why I actually was very hopeful as the Big Beautiful bill was being discussed. I mean, there was like some hope of a federal putting in place a moratorium, and like having this patchwork and having like startups having to focus on all of them. I mean, even following California is hard enough, much less what's happening in Colorado, what's happening in Connecticut, New York. And I do think it like puts on such an administrative burden for startups that really is unfair and definitely does favor like the hyperscalers. And I don't think from a policy standpoint, the government really, and from a competition standpoint, the government's always talking about not wanting to tip, the scales in favor of the incumbents in that way. But that's actually exactly what's happening, given the legislation that's happening at the state level.
Well, so then how can startups engage with policy discussions? How can they monitor what's going on without having a full-time policy team, which I'm fairly certain very few startups have, actually.
I mean, I think it is to the maximum extent possible given bandwidth constraints. I think the hard thing for us is that might mean there are such significant bandwidth constraints that the answer is going to be it's really hard to engage in policy discussions. That's an unfortunate thing. Like we talk regularly with policymakers, we talk regularly with reporters. I don't think people actually really want to hear from us that much. They want to hear from the companies that we work with. That's who they really want to talk to. And we try to like make it possible for them to have some understanding of what the companies in our portfolio are wrestling with. But what they really want to do is go to the portfolio. The challenge is, for all the reasons we've been discussing, it's really hard to be a founder. It's really hard. It's hard to be a founder, and then it's hard to like fly to DC once a month and go and do 25 meetings on the Hill and meet with people in the administration to make the case about why they shouldn't do something that's going to be really hard for you. So we have a lot of empathy for that experience. But to the extent that you actually have bandwidth and are able to make your voices heard, I think it is unbelievably impactful in policy debates for people to really understand what it means for specific individual small companies.
And short of that, which I think is what Matt described as ideal. I mean, short of that, I think figuring out what trade association might banding together with other groups. I mean, so for instance, we're a part of BSA that we have thought to be. I mean, they have been enormously helpful as we've worked through the EU AI Act, as well as like the number of the legislation that's coming online in the U.S. So whether it's that or at least keeping up to date with what's happening. And so if you don't have a team, and you very most likely don't have a team, I mean, leveraging outside counsel to the extent that you can. Obviously, I think that's expensive. So, and if not that, I mean, I do think that the trade association route is a good path.
And for those that are, lucky enough to be partnered with a firm like A16Z that has a policy arm and has people on a team, leveraging those resources is a great choice too. So if you were advising a startup today, what are you tracking, looking at, call it 12 to 18 months out in terms of AI policy? What are you looking ahead to?
So I think you sort of referenced this in one of your opening comments, which I really agree with, which is this is kind of a moment to get things done. And that is very exciting to me. I'm realizing just how different that is from some of my prior professional experiences and prior political moments. Like there are things happening at the state level. And I think we have an opportunity to get those things to be as good as they possibly can for the future of the AI ecosystem. And then despite the failure of to include the preemption vehicle in the one big beautiful bill from the summer, it remains interest in Washington to get something done in AI policy, and I think there's a consensus that means having a robust federal framework that will govern AI effectively. It's unlikely to just be preemption, just solely preemption. The idea is if you're going to preempt some state activity, then from a policy perspective, I don't think it's necessarily from a legal perspective, but from a policy perspective, we want to have more in place. We want more governance. And so then the question, which again is just so exciting for me, is, well, what should it be? What should we have in a federal framework that would be smart governance for AI? And I guess like there are days I'm pessimistic about that and days I'm optimistic, but generally I'm optimistic. I think both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, are interested in doing something here. I think there are options that are not really that partisan, like is enforcement of consumer protection law, is that a Republican concept or a Democrat concept? Like, I don't know. I don't think it is one or the other. I think that's just about good governance. And so we're trying to work with anyone who will work with us to try to figure out if there's a path forward that will establish a sensible governance regime that will be an alternative to some of the stuff we've seen at the state level that we don't think will be good for AI competitiveness in the long run, and an alternative to some of the other markets abroad that we think are going down a road that won't be good for AI competitiveness in the long run.
I'm curious, sir, are there any sleep regulatory issues that you think have the potential to become very relevant for AI startups? Things that are potentially out on the horizon, people are starting to kick around?
But I think that, in terms of sleeper issues, I definitely, I would not be surprised if in the next, 12, 18 months there was, continued export controls around this, in particular involving China, perhaps Russia. So I would be surprised about that. I think that on the antitrust side, that given the focus with antitrust is really on harm, I think it's going to be a number of years before we get to like a showing of harm. So I would be surprised if there was strong antitrust enforcement in the next, year and a half. And then the last area is I do think that states, in particular states where there isn't a lot of traction around AI legislation, that we're going to see increasingly the application of existing laws to AI.
So I'd say one that we've talked about a fair amount is transparency. And so I think for the reasons that you were describing, that's really important to pay attention to, because it will be cumulative. So it won't just be a disclosure requirement under one state regime. It might be several different state regimes. So now there's some required disclosures under 53, then also training data required disclosures from the bill from the last session. And so that will have a cumulative effect. If there's ever a federal transparency standard, but that is not 100% aligned with the state one, that would be an additional burden. And so I think people often talk about transparency as being just easy and common sense. And if we can't agree on anything else, let's do some transparency. I think there's value in transparency, but if we don't get it right, it will really end up being a burden. The second, which is an issue that we spend a lot of time focused on, is what counts as a startup. And you would think that might be like intuitive and obvious, like there are small business administration definitions for what counts as a small business and stuff. In AI, it's really complicated because companies scale quickly and they need to spend an enormous amount of money. Like if you want to get a startup off the ground that competes with Meta's Llama, you are going to have to invest an enormous amount of money in training. And so that might mean you have low probability of success, you have zero revenue, and you're still spending a lot of money on training. And so there are some regulatory proposals that would consider a company like that a startup. A larger company, because if you're devoting a lot of money to training, you could be considered potentially a large company, even if you have no revenue in the door. And so we've been trying to work really hard to establish a revenue threshold as a way to distinguish between small companies and large companies, because when you have revenue, and we can debate like what the revenue threshold should be, but when you have some amount of revenue, you're succeeding in the market, you're taking in money, you can devote some of that to hiring a general counsel, hiring a policy team, hiring outside legal support to help you navigate these issues. And that was actually one of the encouraging things that we saw in SB 53, this disclosure framework that the governor just signed last week. It includes a $500 million revenue threshold and different obligations if you're below that or above it. And I think that's a positive development. If we can like figure out better ways to separate small and large, that's on the positive side. The negative beware side is watch out for policymakers who tell you that their proposal is not going to cover startups, and it actually does.
If I had to pick a sleeper potential regulatory topic, I think data portability and data access are going to be a big feature around competition in particular. The issues of people trying to build systems that operate across multiple kinds of systems inside of enterprises, and they can't get access to the data to do things across systems, will become a bigger and bigger issue.
So it'll be interesting with the EU Data Act, what happens with that.
So we are just a few minutes left. Sorry to get started a little bit late. We have a few minutes left. If there are questions to the audience, maybe I'll start back here and then you'll hop around.
So to spread my background, I got science expert. And what we found is when they passed legislation on Canada that insurance stages and they even made it, there wasn't something that was legislated.
Yeah.
It was something that was decided by a judge in common law, which always probably finds happening in that legislation. So one thing out is, I guess, for A16 is whether it's a reform in the division, it was insurance agent. I thought about the risk of preventing legislation, how to get determined by a judge and more insurance, and not having involved decision.
Okay, so for those that couldn't hear, I'll just quickly recap. She was analogizing to how in Canada, for instance, cyber regulation didn't get adopted because it was really standardized by insurance as the mode by which was you sort of imposed a regime of how to do cyber right. And so could the same thing happen in AI with insurance being a driver for how practices are regulated?
Yeah, so I guess I hear two different things. One is about insurance specifically, and it seems like worth exploring. It's not something I've spent a lot of time on. It seems like it could be desirable in some circumstances if burdensome insurance costs become a sort of day one expense for startups, and I think that could be problematic as well. But it seems like an interesting thing to explore. I also hear you saying, in the absence of formal regulation, are there some self-adjusting things that are going to happen in markets that are
in the common law, right? So upon all actions are governed on relation to the judge decides they have to make care the meet the job.
Yeah, so there are a few things there that are complicated. So one, I think there are already common lawsuits that are being brought against AI companies. We're in the process of seeing how those unfold. I think it is good for companies to not be immune. So if companies are immune, then I think you would see a set of behaviors that would result in people feeling like, I'm using technology that's not safe. I'm using technology where I feel victimized by the company that's producing it. That's not a positive thing. And so I think some liability is probably a positive thing. Infinite liability is a negative thing because that makes it harder for startups to get off the ground. And so I think we are in the process of like seeing what that looks like. I also hear you saying a little bit of like, how will markets in some circumstances self-adjust to address some of the risks that we anticipate seeing? And I went on a little bit of a roadshow at one point to try to understand, we were saying, as I've said here, we should ensure that we can hold people accountable when AI is used to violate a person's civil rights. And so I talked to a series of civil rights prosecutors to understand how accurate that statement was. Like, is there a path to vindication of your rights under current law? And I don't think the answer is yes across the board. And obviously depends on a lot of different factors, but you could imagine a circumstance where a mortgage lender would charge 2% higher rate systematically to women than men, for instance. And so that would violate civil rights law. And the question is like, can you account for that in civil rights law? The answer is yes. And it's important for a few different reasons, including that then if you have Bank of America trying to figure out what AI tool to use to help set their mortgage rates, they're going to require in that process a whole bunch of stuff that is going to ensure that they're not going to be held accountable eventually, because they have they have exposure to the law. And so there's going to be some market corrective effect where an organization like that is going to be taking steps to try to avoid liability in a way that's positive, I think, to like make sure the tool that they have is not exhibiting some kind of really significant bias that's going to result in every woman getting charged 2% higher for mortgage rates. And so do I think that's a panacea? No. Is it going to be perfect? No. But the idea that in the absence of new regulation, everything is wide open, I think is false.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'll probably.
Yeah. In light of the time, I'll just have one last question up here. I saw you raised your hand as well.
So we are at the association members. Would that be having a bit of voice easy to understand how those frameworks work and all the things coordinated? The thing with pre-Series A, just figuring out the most complicated thing for us is being CDPR, figuring out how having customers in different states means we need new privacy laws, even if we have one customer in any one of those states. And there are almost 800 AI bills and state senates being discussed for somewhat forsaken reason. How do you recommend navigating that? As a founder, when resource-wise, how actively should we be looking out those laws on a state-by-state basis where we have customers, or should we just look at some states where we can actually keep an eye out and be cautious about everything?
So maybe I'll let your answer first. I would say it's going to depend on the particulars of what you're doing as a startup. And so if you are working, for instance, in applying AI in the employment space, talk to the employment counsel at your firm, the law firm that you're working with, to get some understanding of what they're tracking in that space. So leverage the resources that you can otherwise have. And that's going to be true in a lot of different areas. The particulars of what you're working on are going to matter. And then as Chum noted earlier, paying attention to trade associations would be the place, because there are groups that are together collectively trying to keep track of the things that are going to matter to their members.
I can plug a couple of public resources as well. One is the National Conference on State Legislatures, tracks various different regulatory developments across various different issues. And so I think if you were interested in what's happening in AI, that would be one spot that you could look. Another, plugging the center that I used to be affiliated with, it's now at NYU, and it publishes an annual State of State Tech Policy report that tries to summarize not just the bills that have been introduced. So I think the 800 number is bills that have been introduced, but it doesn't give you a good sense of like what's the legislation that's been passed that you actually have to comply with. And this NYU report, which will come out in December, summarizing the past year of legislative sessions, will do that. It will have a section on AI that will say this is what's been passed at the state level that you need to comply with.
Are they inspired sources you can help the keep pointing your founders towards as well?
I mean, I think it's working with counsel that you have, and then those are like the public resources, I think. Yeah.
Thank you all for coming and joining us, and I hope you got to get what you wanted out of this presentation. We really appreciate talking.